the last thing we discussed was Andrew Johnson replacing President Abraham Lincoln after he was assassinated, because Johnson was Lincoln's vice president. So when Andrew Johnson comes into office, he is going to have a Reconstruction plan of his own that he will try to carry out kind of in place of Abraham Lincoln's. And I'm going to tell you what that Reconstruction plan incorporated. So Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction plan. He pardoned all Confederates that pledged an oath of allegiance to the United States except the Confederate leaders and wealthy Southern planters. So he pardoned all of the Confederates that would pledge an oath of allegiance except for Confederate leaders and Southern planters. Now, it seems like he's being kind of, he's kind of discriminating Southern planters, but he did blame them for secession, probably because of their extreme use of slavery, and he felt that it was their fault. This whole mess was kind of their fault. So even though they may not have been on the forefronts of the war itself, he does blame them for secession. So he does not pardon those. Also part of his plan, states had to nullify, and remember, nullify just means void and deny, and states had to nullify their ordinance of secession. And so they basically had to void out the fact that they seceded and admit they were wrong, and basically kind of not sweep it under the rug, but admit that it was wrong what they did and that they wouldn't do it again. So they had to void out their official secession. States also had to ratify the 13th Amendment under his plan. And lastly, Johnson decided that states would decide for themselves what the rights of the now free slaves would be. So he decided that states could decide for themselves what the rights of the newly freed slaves would be. Now you can see where this is going to get dangerous, because if the southern states are allowed to make their own laws for these newly freed African Americans, they're going to try to probably push them back into slavery in some way or another. Even though they can't actually have them as slaves since they ratified the 13th Amendment, they're not going to be kind to them, and we're going to talk about that next. But it is kind of interesting that he allows them to do this, and that's going to get a lot of criticism from Congress. But important to know, lastly, about Johnson's plan. With this plan, by December of 1865, all states had re-entered the Union. So by December of 1865, all southern states would have re-entered the Union. Okay, so let's look now at what life in the South is like after the Civil War. So I told you that Johnson's going to allow the southern states to make their own rules for how they're going to handle the newly freed African Americans. The South put black codes in place, and black codes are state laws that denied African Americans certain rights. state laws that denied African Americans certain rights. I'll give you some examples of black codes. They would restrict mobility. They would restrict mobility, meaning the slaves aren't allowed to move around the states as freely as they'd like to. Also, as part of the black codes, they would enforce long work days and weeks upon the new freedmen. When I say freedmen, we're talking about the newly freed slaves, and it's literally spelled like freedmen, but one word. So they enforced long work days and work weeks. They were not allowed to carry weapons. They couldn't vote. The black codes are basically used to keep African Americans in inferior positions. So it seems like change in the South is going to be slow. It's going to be slow moving progress, okay? Well, I mean, it's going to be slow to progress. Okay, there was an organization established by the government that attempted to help the newly freedmen, and that is known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government organization that provided aid and assistance to freedmen after the war. The goal of the Freedmen's Bureau was to help the freemen transition into free life. So to help them transition into free life. Help to get them education, to help them find jobs, and to help them find a home. Okay, William T. Sherman's going to make another reappearance in our notes, and it's just too good to pass up. So, you may have heard of the saying, 40 acres and a mule, and this is Sherman's plan, and I'll kind of explain what that plan, where it originates. But essentially, during the war, as the Union was moving through the South, many Confederate plantation owners often fled their land. And over time, as the war, was ending, these new freemen would claim this kind of abandoned land for themselves. General William T. Sherman began to offer freedmen 40 acres of land and the use of army mules. And he was doing this mostly to help, to kind of pay back some of the African American involvement with helping the Union Army win, the war. So he was kind of trying to reciprocate a little bit. Eventually, some of these Confederates are going to attempt to move back and get their land back, and In some cases, they did have to give it back, which is kind of sad. But for a while there, they were able to, kind of possess their own land and work their own land for themselves, which was nice. Okay, now we'll talk about the next big amendment that comes after the 13th. Remember, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment is going to do something differently, but it's going to also involve the newly freed slaves. The 14th Amendment states that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. all persons born or naturalized. Naturalized means you may not have been born here, but you're working towards becoming a citizen by spending a significant amount of time here, okay? Were citizens, though. That's the end of the amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens. Basically stating you cannot deny citizenship based on race or anything else. So the key here is the 14th Amendment grants African Americans citizenship. The 14th Amendment also states that state laws cannot deprive any citizen of their rights or equal protection under the law. So you cannot, have these laws, such as the Black Codes, that are denying what are now citizens, the African Americans, equal rights under the law. So this is going to be a very slow-moving process, but, and it takes a while for the South to really understand this and accept it and act on it, but technically, once the slaves became citizens with this amendment, the Black Codes became unconstitutional. Okay, really quickly, I want to talk about Scalawags and Carpetbaggers. I'll briefly introduce this because it's two terms that are used at this time in America. They are two insulting terms referring to two different groups of people. So they are insulting, not like a nice connotation to it. So I'll start with a scalawag. A scalawag would be used to refer to someone who was a Southern Republican. So Scalawag was a Southern Republican. Most were small farmers who wanted to see a shift in power in the South. Small farmers who wanted to move away from the elite plantation owners having all the power. You can imagine that most of the South doesn't really care for a Southern Republican since they're instituting all this Reconstruction, but so that was an insulting term used to describe Southern Republicans. A carpetbagger was a Northerner who moved south after the war. Think about that. Why would a Northerner move south after the war with all this destruction and desolation and this really poor situation? Well, it's for economic opportunity. So they would move south after the war to make money. When you have a clean slate, when you have a kind of cleaned out area, it's the opportunity for regrowth. And so they knew they could make money if they would move down to the South and help develop the devastated South. And this political cartoon kind of demonstrates a carpetbagger. Okay, moving on to radical Reconstruction. Basically, an act will be passed in 1867, the Radical Reconstruction Act. It is going to be probably the most harsh punishments used against the South in effort to force the South kind of back into the Union and to kind of try to rid them of their unfair ways with the African Americans. And I'll explain all this, but I'll tell you exactly what the Reconstruction Act of 1867 did, but just understand that this is very radical Reconstruction, okay? Very radical Republican legislation trying to punish the South. So, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 divided the South into military districts. And you can kind of see that on the PowerPoint. It divided the South into military districts. Federal troops were sent in, and a general was in command within each district. So the military is now in charge of the South. The purpose of this was to force change on the South. The purpose of this was to force change on the South, and I will give you several examples of this. 1, to ensure voting rights for African Americans. So you'd have military troops there trying to make sure African Americans were being allowed to vote according to their right as a citizen. 2nd, to ratify the 14th Amendment. To ratify the 14th Amendment. 3rdly, to make sure new state constitutions were acceptable. And lastly, to keep Confederate leaders from voting. To make sure Confederate leaders weren't voting. So this is going to be very harsh to the South, that they're now going to be run by, military districts, basically, or within military districts, but it's not, it's really to make sure that they are not abusing things passed, such as, the 14th Amendment, where it says, oh, you can't have these black codes that don't protect, the same, or the rights of, different men. And so they're trying to make sure they are obeying that moving forward. Okay, let's talk about the first presidential impeachment, okay? Johnson and Congress did not get along very well. Johnson liked to veto a lot. He liked to veto. And he angered radical Republicans in Congress by vetoing many of their bills. So he angered many radical Republicans by vetoing many of their bills. But the last straw is when President Johnson dismissed Edwin Stanton, and I have him on the screen. When President Johnson dismissed Edwin Stanton as his Secretary of War, now, he didn't really give a specific reason, or a good enough reason as to why Stanton was not a adequate Secretary of War. However, Stanton was the last remaining radical Republican left on the cabinet. He was the last remaining radical Republican left on the cabinet. So this made Congress really mad when Johnson lets him go. So the House moves to impeach Johnson, and Johnson is formally impeached by the House of Representatives, which means he is sent to the Senate to be tried. But he was acquitted, meaning he was found not guilty. But he was actually one vote short of being thrown out of office. He was one vote short of being thrown out of office. You can guess that it was the radical Republicans who were trying to throw Johnson out of office. But most people sided with Johnson on this. Democrats and moderate Republicans sided with him, but you don't have to know who sided with who. Okay, last thing we'll talk about really quickly is the presidential election of 1860. Johnson will not run for re-election. Ulysses S. Grant, as you know him, the former Union general, ran as the Republican candidate. And Grant easily wins this election. So Ulysses S. Grant is our new president. Okay, we're going to start on Monday with the passing of the 15th Amendment, which is very important. And I hope you all have a great weekend. Please write down any questions you had while listening to the screencast, and I will see y'all on Monday. Go Tigers!